In a small village, a cat named Whiskers discovered a magic fish in a pond. The fish promised 3 wishes in exchange for its freedom. Whiskers wished for endless fish, a cozy bed, and a bell that rang softly. The fish granted all 3 wishes and swam away. The morning sun cast long shadows across Camp Pendleton as Staff Sergeant Marcus Iron Mike Thompson walked slowly toward the training grounds. His weathered face bore the marks of 30 years in the Marines, with deep lines carved by desert winds and countless battles. At 52, his gray hair was cropped short in regulation style, but his movements seemed stiff and deliberate, betraying the toll of decades in service. Behind him, a group of young recruits whispered and snickered among themselves. These fresh-faced Marines, barely out of boot camp, had been assigned to advanced combat training under Thompson's supervision. They saw an old man who moved like his best days were behind him, someone who probably spent more time behind a desk than in the field. "Look at Grandpa Thompson," whispered Private Rodriguez, a cocky 20-year-old from Los Angeles who had been a star athlete in high school. "Guy can barely walk straight. How's he supposed to teach us anything about fighting?" Private Jenkins, a tall, muscular recruit from Texas, joined in the mockery. "I heard he hasn't seen real action in years. Probably just pushes papers now. My drill instructor back in Paris Island could run circles around this fossil." The other recruits laughed quietly, careful not to let Thompson hear them directly. There was Private Morrison, a former college football player who stood 6'4" and weighed 220 pounds of solid muscle. Next to him was Private Chen, a martial arts enthusiast who had earned a black belt in karate before enlisting. The 5th member of their group was Private Williams, a former boxer who had won several amateur championships in his hometown of Detroit. Thompson continued walking, seemingly oblivious to their whispered comments. His olive drab uniform was perfectly pressed, his boots polished to a mirror shine, but his pace was unhurried and measured. To the young Marines, he looked like every stereotype of a washed-up veteran coasting toward retirement. "I bet I could take him down with one hand tied behind my back," Morrison boasted quietly. "Look how slow he moves. Guy probably gets winded walking upstairs." The training facility loomed ahead, a large building surrounded by obstacle courses, combat training areas, and equipment storage units. Thompson had requested this particular group for specialized hand-to-hand combat training, though none of the recruits understood why. Their previous instructors had been younger, more energetic Marines who could demonstrate techniques with speed and power. As they approached the entrance, Thompson finally stopped and turned to face the group. His steel-gray eyes swept over each recruit, taking in their confident postures and barely concealed smirks. He had been in the Corps long enough to recognize the look of young Marines who thought they knew everything about warfare. "Gentlemen," Thompson said, his voice carrying the authority of 3 decades in uniform, "today we begin advanced close-quarters combat training. This isn't the basic hand-to-hand you learned in boot camp. This is what keeps Marines alive when everything else fails." Rodriguez exchanged a glance with Jenkins, both struggling not to laugh. They had all excelled in their basic combat training, earning high marks for physical fitness and fighting techniques. The idea that this old-timer could teach them anything new seemed ridiculous. Thompson noticed their expressions but said nothing. He had encountered countless young Marines over the years who confused age with weakness, experience with obsolescence. Most learned their lesson eventually, though some required more convincing than others. "Before we begin," Thompson continued, "I want each of you to understand something. Combat isn't about being young or strong or fast. It's about knowing when to strike, how to strike, and what will end a fight before your opponent knows it has begun." Williams, the former boxer, couldn't help but smirk. He had knocked out opponents twice Thompson's size in the ring. The old man's philosophical approach to fighting seemed quaint compared to the raw power and speed that had made Williams a champion. "Now," Thompson said, removing his service jacket and hanging it carefully on a nearby hook, "who wants to demonstrate their current skill level?" The 5 recruits looked at each other uncertainly. They had expected lectures, maybe some technique demonstrations, not an immediate sparring session. Thompson stood before them in his undershirt, and for the first time they could see the lean muscle that still defined his frame despite his age. Morrison stepped forward first, his confidence unshaken. "I'll go first, Staff Sergeant," Thompson nodded approvingly. "Good. Remember, this is training. The objective is to learn, not to prove anything. But Morrison was already thinking about how impressive it would look to his fellow recruits when he easily handled the old veteran. He had size, youth, and strength on his side. What could possibly go wrong? The other 4 recruits formed a loose circle around the training area, anticipating what they assumed would be an easy victory for their teammate. They were about to learn that in the Marine Corps, assumptions could be dangerous things, and that sometimes the most unassuming opponents were the most deadly, ing Whiskers' content and purring in the sun. Morrison cracked his knuckles and rolled his shoulders, warming up like he was preparing for a football game. At 6'4" and built like a linebacker, he towered over Thompson by nearly half a foot. The recruit bounced on his toes, showing off the athletic agility that had made him a star player in college. "Ready when you are, Staff Sergeant," Morrison said with a confident grin. Thompson simply nodded and took a relaxed stance, his hands at his sides. He didn't raise his fists or assume any recognizable fighting position. To the watching recruits, he looked like a man waiting for a bus rather than preparing for combat. "Is he even going to try?" Chen whispered to Williams. "Morrison's going to steamroll right over him." Morrison began circling Thompson, looking for an opening. His training had taught him to use his reach advantage, to keep his opponent at a distance while landing quick jabs. He threw a few testing punches, none meant to connect, just to gauge Thompson's reflexes. The old Marine didn't react to the feints. He remained perfectly still, watching Morrison with those gray eyes that seemed to take in everything. It was unnerving, but Morrison pushed down his unease and committed to his first real attack. He launched a quick 1-2 combination, expecting to land at least one solid hit on the seemingly defenseless veteran. But as his fist cut through the air, Thompson moved. Not quickly, not dramatically, but with a subtle shift that made Morrison's punch miss by inches. Before Morrison could recover his balance, Thompson's hand shot out and grabbed the recruit's extended wrist. The movement was so smooth and natural that it looked almost casual, but Morrison suddenly found his arm trapped in what felt like a steel vise. "Rule number 1, Thompson said calmly, his voice conversational despite the ongoing struggle. "Never commit to an attack unless you're certain it will land." Morrison tried to pull his arm free, but Thompson's grip was immovable. Panic began to creep into the young Marine's eyes as he realized he couldn't break loose. He swung his free hand toward Thompson's head, putting all his strength behind the punch. Thompson caught that wrist too, now holding both of Morrison's arms in a grip that the much larger man couldn't break. The veteran's hands looked ordinary, even small compared to Morrison's massive fists, but they held the recruit as effectively as handcuffs. "Rule number 2, Thompson continued in the same calm tone. "Anger makes you predictable." Morrison's face flushed red with embarrassment and growing rage. He was being manhandled by a man old enough to be his father, and his fellow recruits were watching every second of his humiliation. He tried to use his superior size and strength to bull his way out of Thompson's hold, throwing his weight forward in an attempt to knock the veteran down. Thompson stepped to the side, using Morrison's own momentum against him. The recruit stumbled forward, off balance and out of control. Thompson released one wrist and placed his hand on Morrison's back, applying just enough pressure to send the big Marine tumbling to the ground. Morrison hit the mat hard, the wind knocked out of him. He rolled over and looked up at Thompson, who stood exactly where he had started, not even breathing hard. The entire exchange had lasted less than 30 seconds. "Rule number 3, Thompson said, extending a hand to help Morrison up. "The fight is over before most people realize it has begun." Morrison stared at the offered hand, his mind struggling to process what had just happened. He had been completely dominated without Thompson throwing a single punch or making any aggressive move. The veteran had simply redirected Morrison's own energy and strength against him. The other 4 recruits stood in stunned silence. Rodriguez's smirk had vanished, replaced by a look of confusion and growing concern. Jenkins was frowning, trying to understand how such a large, athletic man had been so easily defeated by someone who looked like he should be planning his retirement. Morrison finally took Thompson's hand and allowed himself to be pulled to his feet. His uniform was rumpled and his face was red, but more than his pride was wounded. Everything he thought he knew about fighting had just been turned upside down. "That was just luck," Morrison muttered, though his voice lacked conviction. "Let me try again." Thompson shook his head. "That wasn't luck, son. That was 30 years of experience in situations where second place means you don't come home. Who's next?" Williams stepped forward, his boxer's instincts telling him that Morrison had simply been overconfident and sloppy. Williams had fought trained opponents before, men who knew how to use technique to overcome size disadvantages. He wouldn't make the same mistakes as his teammate. "I'll give it a shot, Staff Sergeant," Williams said, raising his hands in a classic boxing stance. Thompson's expression didn't change, but there was something in his eyes that suggested he had been hoping for a more challenging opponent. Williams had technique and training, unlike Morrison's raw athleticism. This would be more interesting. The other recruits watched with renewed attention, wondering if the former boxer would fare better against the surprising veteran. They were about to discover that Thompson had been holding back in his first demonstration, and that Morrison's defeat had been the gentlest lesson the old Marine was prepared to teach. In a small village, a cat named Whiskers discovered a magic fish in a pond. The fish promised 3 wishes in exchange for its freedom. Whiskers wished for endless fish, a cozy bed, and a bell that rang softly. The fish granted all 3 wishes and swam away, leaving Whiskers content and purring in the sun. Williams moved with the fluid grace of a trained boxer, his footwork precise and controlled. Unlike Morrison's wild charging style, Williams kept his distance and studied his opponent carefully. He had watched Thompson's technique with Morrison and recognized that the veteran had used redirection rather than brute force. "Smart approach," Thompson acknowledged, noting Williams's defensive posture. "You've had real training." Williams nodded, circling slowly while keeping his guard up. His amateur boxing career had taught him patience and timing. He threw a few light jabs to test Thompson's reactions, watching for patterns or weaknesses he could exploit. Thompson moved minimally, shifting just enough to avoid the testing punches. But Williams noticed something Morrison had missed. The veteran's eyes never left his own. Thompson wasn't watching his hands or his feet. He was reading Williams' intentions through his eyes and micro-expressions. "You're different from your friend," Thompson observed. "You actually understand fighting." Williams feinted with his left and threw a quick right cross, a combination that had knocked out several opponents in the ring. The punch was fast, accurate, and delivered with perfect form. But as it neared Thompson's face, the veteran's head moved slightly to the right, and the fist passed harmlessly by his ear. Before Williams could recover, Thompson stepped inside his guard and placed his palm against Williams' chest. It didn't look like a strike, more like someone gently pushing a door open. But Williams felt an explosive force that sent him stumbling backward, his carefully maintained balance completely destroyed. Williams caught himself before falling, his boxer's reflexes keeping him upright, but his eyes were wide with shock. Thompson had barely seemed to move, yet the impact had felt like being hit by a truck. The veteran's palm strike had generated more power than punches from heavyweights Williams had faced in the ring. "Boxing teaches excellent technique," Thompson said conversationally. "But it has rules. Combat doesn't." Williams reset his stance, more cautious now. He realized he was facing something completely outside his experience. Thompson's movements defied everything Williams had learned about leverage, power generation, and fighting mechanics. The former boxer tried a different approach, using his superior reach to land quick jabs while staying out of Thompson's range. For a moment, it seemed to work. Williams landed 2 light hits on Thompson's shoulder and chest, proving that the veteran wasn't invincible. But Thompson didn't react to the hits as Williams expected. Instead of backing away or raising his guard, the veteran stepped closer, walking through the punches as if they were raindrops. Williams found his careful distance management suddenly useless as Thompson closed the gap between them. Thompson's hand moved in a blur, striking 3 pressure points on Williams's right arm in quick succession. The boxer's punching arm went completely numb. Hanging uselessly at his side, Williams stared at his unresponsive limb in shock, unable to understand what had just happened. "Pressure points," Thompson explained matter-of-factly. "Your arm will be fine in a few minutes, but right now it's not going to help you." Williams tried to compensate with his left hand, but Thompson had already moved to his blind side. The veteran's elbow connected gently with a spot just below Williams's ribs, and the former boxer crumpled to his knees, gasping for breath. It hadn't been a violent blow, barely more than a firm poke, but it had targeted a nerve cluster that temporarily paralyzed Williams's diaphragm. He knelt on the mat, struggling to breathe while his numbed arm slowly began to tingle back to life. Thompson helped Williams to his feet, supporting him until his breathing returned to normal. That's pressure point fighting. Used correctly, it can disable an opponent without causing permanent damage. Williams nodded weakly, still trying to process what had happened. His boxing experience had included sparring with much larger and stronger men, but none of them had been able to shut down his body's functions with such precise, minimal contact. The three remaining recruits watched in growing unease. Rodriguez's earlier bravado had completely evaporated. Jenkins was unconsciously backing away from the training area. Chen, despite his martial arts background, looked like he was reconsidering his confidence in his own abilities. Two of their group had been easily defeated, and Thompson hadn't even broken a sweat. The veteran stood calmly in the center of the mat, looking exactly as he had when the session began. There was no sign of exertion, no indication that he had just overwhelmed two well-trained athletic young Marines. "Who's next?" Thompson asked, his tone suggesting he was genuinely curious about the answer. Rodriguez, Jenkins, and Chen exchanged uncertain glances. None of them wanted to step forward, but backing down would be admitting that they had been wrong about the old veteran. Their pride as Marines warred with their growing understanding that they were facing something far beyond their experience. Chen finally stepped forward, his martial arts training giving him a framework for understanding what Thompson was doing. He had studied pressure point techniques and had some knowledge of combat systems that emphasized efficiency over power. "I'll try. Staff Sergeant," Chen said, bowing slightly in the traditional martial arts manner. Thompson returned the bow, showing respect for Chen's formal training. "What style do you practice?" "Karate and some jiu-jitsu, Staff Sergeant. I know it's different from military combat training." Thompson smiled slightly, the first change in his stoic expression since the training had begun. "Not as different as you might think." "Show me what you've learned." Chen assumed a traditional fighting stance, one that demonstrated years of disciplined training. Unlike Morrison's raw athleticism or Williams' boxing technique, Chen's posture showed the influence of centuries-old fighting traditions. The other recruits watched with renewed hope, thinking that perhaps their teammate's formal martial arts background would give him an edge against the mysterious veteran. Chen moved with the disciplined precision of traditional martial arts, his stance perfectly balanced and his movements flowing like water. His years of training were evident in every step, each motion calculated and controlled. Unlike his teammates' more aggressive approaches, Chen began with a respectful distance, studying Thompson's posture and breathing. "Good form," Thompson acknowledged. "Your sensei taught you well." Chen executed a series of quick techniques, testing Thompson's defenses with kicks and punches that demonstrated excellent flexibility and timing. His strikes were crisp and accurate, showing the kind of muscle memory that came from thousands of hours of practice. Thompson responded differently than he had with the previous two opponents. Instead of simply avoiding or redirecting Chen's attacks, he began to counter with techniques that Chen recognized from his own training. The veteran was using martial arts principles, but with modifications that Chen had never seen before. When Chen threw a traditional front kick, Thompson caught his foot and twisted it in a way that forced Chen to spin around to avoid injury. But instead of releasing him, Thompson maintained control of Chen's leg while striking a pressure point on his hip. Chen's leg went numb and he hopped awkwardly on one foot, trying to maintain his balance. "Military adaptation of traditional techniques," Thompson explained while Chen struggled with his suddenly unresponsive leg. "We take what works and modify it for real-world situations." Chen attempted to use his jiu-jitsu training to grapple with Thompson, hoping that ground fighting would neutralize some of the veteran's advantages. He managed to grab Thompson's arm and attempted a throw that should have sent the older man to the mat. But Thompson's base was like concrete. Instead of being thrown, he allowed Chen to commit to the technique, then used the recruit's own momentum to spin him around. Chen found himself airborne for a brief moment before landing hard on his back, with Thompson's knee resting lightly against his throat. "The problem with sport martial arts," Thompson said calmly, not even breathing hard, "is that they're designed for fair fights with rules. Combat is neither fair nor governed by rules." Chen tapped out, the universal signal of submission. Thompson immediately released him and helped him to his feet. Feeling was already returning to Chen's numbed leg, though he walked with a slight limp. "Your training is excellent," Thompson told him, "but it's designed for tournaments and demonstrations. What I'm showing you is how those same techniques work when your life depends on them." The remaining two recruits, Rodriguez and Jenkins, now looked genuinely frightened. Chen had been their most technically skilled fighter, and he had been defeated as easily as the others. Worse, Thompson was barely showing any signs of effort. He stood in the center of the training area looking like he could continue for hours. Rodriguez reluctantly stepped forward, his earlier cockiness completely gone. The young Marine from Los Angeles had been bragging about his street fighting experience, but watching three of his fellow recruits get systematically dismantled had shattered his confidence. "Staff Sergeant," Rodriguez said hesitantly, "maybe we should just watch the demonstrations instead of—" "No," Thompson interrupted firmly. "You all volunteered for advanced combat training. That means you learn by doing, not by watching. Step up, Marine." Rodriguez moved forward with obvious reluctance. His street fighting experience had taught him that aggression and speed were the keys to victory, but he had seen those approaches fail against Thompson. He didn't know what else to try. Thompson sensed Rodriguez's uncertainty and decided to end this demonstration quickly. The veteran wanted to make his point clear before moving on to the actual instruction. Rodriguez threw a wild haymaker punch, hoping to catch Thompson off guard with its unpredictability. But the veteran had faced countless desperate opponents over the years, and desperation made fighters even more predictable than anger. Thompson stepped inside the wild swing and placed his hand on Rodriguez's chest, just as he had done with Williams. But this time, instead of a push, he applied a gentle upward pressure to a specific point just below Rodriguez's sternum. Rodriguez's legs buckled immediately, and he collapsed to his knees, gasping and clutching his chest. He wasn't injured, but his body had reacted as if all his strength had suddenly drained away. He looked up at Thompson with confusion and fear. "Solar plexus pressure point," Thompson explained, helping Rodriguez back to his feet. "Disrupts your breathing and temporarily affects your muscle control. You'll be fine in a moment." As Rodriguez caught his breath, all eyes turned to Jenkins, the last remaining recruit. The tall Texan had gone pale, realizing that he was about to face the same fate as his four teammates. His earlier confidence about running circles around the fossil now seemed like a cruel joke. "Well, Private Jenkins," Thompson said, turning to face the last recruit. "Ready to learn what 30 years of experience looks like?" Jenkins swallowed hard, knowing there was no way to avoid what was coming. He had mocked the old veteran along with the others, and now he was going to pay the price for his arrogance. The worst part was knowing that Thompson wasn't even trying to hurt them. This was just a demonstration of how outclassed they truly were. "Yes, Staff Sergeant," Jenkins managed to say, though his voice cracked slightly. Thompson nodded approvingly. "Good. Fear is healthy. It keeps Marines alive. Now show me what you've got." Jenkins approached the center of the training area like a man walking to his execution, while his four defeated teammates watched from the sidelines, still trying to process what they had witnessed. Jenkins stood frozen in the center of the training mat, his mind racing through everything he had just witnessed. Four of his fellow Marines, each with their own strengths and training, had been systematically defeated by techniques he didn't understand. The tall Texan's earlier bravado felt like a distant memory as he faced Thompson's steady gaze. "I can see you're thinking," Thompson observed. "That's good." "What are you thinking about?" Jenkins swallowed nervously. "Honestly, Staff Sergeant, I'm thinking about how wrong we were about you. We thought—" He trailed off, embarrassed to admit their earlier mockery. "You thought I was a washed-up old man who couldn't teach you anything." Thompson finished for him. "I know exactly what you all thought. I've seen that look before." The veteran's expression softened slightly, though his posture remained alert and ready. "Let me ask you something, Jenkins. What do you think makes a good fighter?" Jenkins considered the question carefully, aware that his answer would be important. "Speed, strength, good technique? Those can help," Thompson agreed. "But they're not the most important thing. You want to know what makes a good fighter? Experience. Knowing what your opponent is going to do before they do it. Understanding that every fight is unique, but human nature follows patterns." Thompson began to circle Jenkins slowly, not in an aggressive way, but like an instructor making a point. "You see, when I was your age, I thought just like you do. I was strong, fast, well-trained. I thought those things made me invincible." Jenkins turned to keep Thompson in sight, but the veteran's casual movement was making him dizzy. There was something hypnotic about the way Thompson moved, fluid and unpredictable, yet somehow purposeful. "Then I got deployed to Somalia," Thompson continued. Real combat, real bullets, real enemies who wanted to kill me. I learned very quickly that all my training meant nothing if I couldn't read a situation correctly. Without warning, Thompson's hand shot out toward Jenkins's face. The recruit instinctively flinched and raised his hands to block, but the veteran's fingers stopped just inches from his nose. "You see?" Thompson said. "You just told me everything I needed to know about how you fight. You're reactive, not proactive. You wait for attacks and then respond. That works in training, but it'll get you killed in combat." Jenkins realized he was breathing hard even though nothing had actually happened. Thompson's feint had triggered a full adrenaline response, making his heart race and his muscles tense. "Now," Thompson said, stepping back to his original position, "let's see what happens when you try to be proactive instead of reactive." Jenkins tried to center himself, drawing on every piece of training he had received. He attempted to read Thompson's body language, looking for tells that might indicate what the veteran was planning. But Thompson's posture gave away nothing, remaining perfectly neutral and balanced. Finally, Jenkins committed to an attack. He threw a quick jab followed immediately by a kick, hoping the combination would overwhelm Thompson's defenses. But as his fist moved forward, Thompson seemed to simply disappear from where he had been standing. Jenkins' punch hit empty air, and his kick found nothing but space. Off balance from his failed combination, he stumbled forward trying to regain his footing. That's when he felt Thompson's presence behind him. "Rule number 4, Thompson's voice came from directly behind Jenkins's ear. "Position is everything. The right position makes you untouchable. The wrong position makes you helpless." Jenkins tried to spin around to face Thompson, but found his movement restricted by what felt like steel cables wrapped around his arms. The veteran had somehow gotten behind him and applied some kind of hold that prevented Jenkins from turning around or breaking free. "This is called a rear naked choke in ground fighting," Thompson explained calmly. "But I've modified it. Instead of cutting off your air supply, I'm just controlling your movement. You can breathe fine, but you can't escape." Jenkins struggled against the hold, using all his strength to try to break free. But Thompson's grip was perfect, applying pressure in exactly the right places to neutralize Jenkins's size and strength advantages. The more the recruit struggled, the tighter the hold seemed to become. "Stop fighting it," Thompson advised. "The more energy you waste trying to escape, the easier it becomes for me to control you." This is another lesson about combat. Sometimes the harder you try, the worse your situation becomes. Jenkins forced himself to stop struggling, and immediately felt some of the pressure ease. Thompson wasn't hurting him, just demonstrating complete control over his movement and position. "Better," Thompson said, releasing the hold and stepping back. "You're learning to think instead of just react." Jenkins turned around, rubbing his arms where Thompson had held him. Like the others, he was unhurt but thoroughly humbled. The veteran had made him helpless without causing any pain or injury. "Now," Thompson said, addressing all 5 recruits who were now gathered around the training area, "does anyone still think I'm too old to teach you anything useful?" The silence that followed was complete. All 5 young Marines stared at Thompson with a mixture of respect, fear, and genuine curiosity. Their earlier mockery seemed not just wrong but dangerously naive. "Good," Thompson nodded approvingly, "because now that we've established that you don't know everything, we can begin your real education. What you just experienced was the difference between fighting and combat. Fighting is what you do in sports or in bars. Combat is what keeps you alive when someone is trying to kill you." The recruits exchanged glances, each of them processing what they had learned about themselves and their limitations. Thompson had shattered their confidence, but he had done it without humiliating them or causing injury. It was a masterful demonstration of controlled power and superior skill. Thompson walked over to a nearby bench and picked up a worn leather folder, its edges softened by years of handling. He opened it carefully, revealing photographs, medals, and official documents that told the story of a distinguished military career. "Before we continue with training," Thompson said, his voice taking on a more serious tone, "I think you should understand who you're learning from." He held up the first photograph, showing a much younger version of himself in desert camouflage, standing with a group of Marines in what appeared to be a Middle Eastern setting. The young Thompson in the photo looked lean and dangerous, his eyes holding the same intensity the recruits had just experienced. "This was taken in Iraq, 2004, Thompson explained. "I was a sergeant then, leading a reconnaissance team behind enemy lines. We spent 3 months gathering intelligence on insurgent operations. Morrison, still nursing his wounded pride, looked at the photo with growing interest. The man in the picture bore little resemblance to the old fossil they had mocked earlier. This was clearly a warrior in his prime. Thompson showed them another photograph, this one from Afghanistan. It depicted him receiving a Bronze Star for valor, with other Marines standing at attention in the background. This was after we rescued a captured pilot from a Taliban stronghold. Thompson continued matter-of-factly. The mission required infiltrating an enemy compound, neutralizing 12 hostiles and extracting under fire. I was 35 then, and I thought I knew everything about combat. Williams, whose arm was still tingling from the pressure point strikes, stared at the medal in the photograph. "Staff Sergeant, how many Bronze Stars do you have?" "3, Thompson replied simply. "Plus 2 Purple Hearts, a Silver Star, and some others. But the medals aren't the point. The point is what I learned earning them." He pulled out a more recent photograph showing himself with a group of Special Forces operators. Even in this later picture, Thompson looked formidable, though the gray in his hair was beginning to show. "This was from my time training Special Operations units," Thompson explained. "For the last 10 years, I've been teaching advanced combat techniques to the military's elite fighters. Delta Force, Navy SEALs, Marine Force Recon. The techniques you just experienced, they're what I teach to operators who face the most dangerous missions in the world." Rodriguez felt his face burn with embarrassment as he realized the magnitude of their earlier mistake. They hadn't just mocked an old veteran, they had insulted one of the military's premier combat instructors. "But here's the thing," Thompson continued, closing the folder. "All those medals, all that experience, all those years of training elite operators, none of it means anything if I can't pass that knowledge on to the next generation of Marines." He looked each recruit in the eye as he spoke. "You 5 aren't special operations. You're regular Marines who may find yourselves in extraordinary situations. My job is to give you the tools to survive those situations and come home to your families." Thompson set the folder aside and moved back to the center of the training area. "What you experienced today wasn't meant to humiliate you. It was meant to save your lives. Every technique I used, every principle I demonstrated, could mean the difference between life and death in combat." Chen raised his hand tentatively. "Staff Sergeant, where did you learn those pressure point techniques?" "They're not in any martial arts system I've studied." Thompson smiled grimly. "I learned them from people who were trying to kill me. Combat teaches you things that no dojo or training manual ever could. When your life depends on ending a fight quickly and quietly, you learn techniques that most martial artists never discover." He gestured for the recruits to gather closer. "The enemy doesn't care about your black belt or your boxing record or how much you can bench press. They care about eliminating you as efficiently as possible. That's what I'm going to teach you to do to them." Jenkins, still processing his encounter with Thompson's rear control technique, asked, "How do we learn to move like you do, the way you seem to disappear and reappear behind me?" "Practice," Thompson answered. "Thousands of hours of practice under pressure. But more importantly, you learn to think like your opponent. Every move you make telegraphs your intentions to someone who knows how to read body language. I knew what each of you was going to do before you did it." Williams nodded slowly, beginning to understand. "So it wasn't that we were too slow. It was that we were too predictable?" "Exactly," Thompson confirmed. "Speed without strategy is just flailing. Strength without technique is just wasted energy. You all have the physical tools to be excellent fighters, but tools are useless without the knowledge of how and when to use them." Morrison, his earlier arrogance completely gone, asked quietly, "Staff Sergeant, will you really be able to teach us to fight like that?" Thompson studied the big recruit for a moment before answering. "That depends on how willing you are to admit that everything you thought you knew about fighting is probably wrong. It depends on whether you can set aside your egos and listen to someone who's survived more combat than you can imagine." He paused, letting his words sink in. "But if you can do that, if you can approach this training with the respect it deserves, then yes, I can teach you to be warriors instead of just tough guys." The 5 recruits exchanged glances, a new understanding passing between them. They had walked into this training session as cocky young Marines who thought they had nothing to learn from an old veteran. They were leaving as humbled students who had glimpsed the vast difference between fighting and warfare. "Tomorrow," Thompson announced, "we begin your real education. Report here at 0600 hours, ready to work harder than you've ever worked in your lives. We have a lot of ground to cover, And the techniques you need to learn could save not just your own lives, but the lives of the Marines who will depend on you in combat. As the recruits filed out of the training facility, each lost in his own thoughts, Thompson watched them go with satisfaction. The first step in teaching warriors was breaking down the barriers of false confidence and ignorance. That mission was accomplished. Now the real work could begin. 6 months later, the same 5 Marines stood in formation outside the Camp Pendleton training facility. But they were completely transformed. Their posture was different, more alert and confident without being arrogant. Their eyes held a new awareness, constantly scanning their surroundings with the practiced vigilance of experienced fighters. Thompson emerged from the building carrying the same leather folder, but today it contained 5 new sets of orders. These recruits were no longer students. They were graduating from the most intensive combat training program the Marines offered. "Marines," Thompson called out, and the 5 snapped to attention with precision that would have made their drill instructors proud. "You've completed Advanced Close Quarters Combat Certification. In 6 months, you've learned techniques that took me years to master in the field." Morrison, now lean and efficient rather than bulky and intimidating, stepped forward when Thompson called his name. The big Marine had learned to use his size strategically rather than relying on it as a crutch. His movements were controlled and purposeful, showing the influence of months of pressure point training and tactical positioning. "Morrison," Thompson said, handing him his certification, "you've learned that strength without strategy is weakness. Your size is now an asset instead of a liability." Williams received his certification next. The former boxer's technique had evolved far beyond simple punching combinations. He could now fight effectively at any range using throws, pressure points, and joint manipulation with the same skill he had once reserved for boxing. "Williams," Thompson noted, "you've learned that real combat has no rules, no referee, and no bell to save you. You fight until the threat is eliminated." Chen's transformation was perhaps the most dramatic. His traditional martial arts background had been completely integrated with military combat techniques. He moved with fluid efficiency, combining the best aspects of his karate training with the lethal practicality Thompson had taught him. "Chen," Thompson said, "you've learned the difference between art and warfare. Both have their place, but only one keeps you alive in combat." Rodriguez had overcome his street fighting habits and learned the discipline that separated trained fighters from mere brawlers. His technique was now precise and economical, wasting no movement or energy. "Rodriguez," Thompson observed, "you've learned that real toughness isn't about showing off. It's about doing what needs to be done, when it needs to be done, regardless of the cost." Finally, Jenkins received his certification. The tall Texan had developed into perhaps the most naturally gifted of the group, his initial fear having transformed into healthy respect for the dangers of combat. "Jenkins," Thompson said, "you've learned that fear is information, not weakness. Use it to stay alive and bring your fellow Marines home." As the ceremony concluded, Thompson stepped back and regarded the 5 Marines with evident pride. These were no longer the cocky recruits who had mocked him 6 months earlier. They were warriors, trained in techniques that could mean the difference between life and death in combat. "Tomorrow you deploy to Afghanistan," Thompson announced. "Everything you've learned here, every technique you've practiced, every principle you've absorbed, may be put to the test. Remember what I've taught you. Combat is about survival, not glory. Your job is to complete the mission and bring each other home." Morrison spoke for the group. "Staff Sergeant Thompson, we owe you an apology. When we first met you, we thought—" Thompson held up a hand, stopping him. "You thought I was a washed-up old man who couldn't teach you anything. You were young, confident, and ignorant. That's exactly what young Marines are supposed to be." He smiled slightly, the first genuine smile they had seen from him in months of training. "But you were also teachable. You set aside your pride and learned from someone who had more experience than you. That's what good Marines do." The 5 Marines stood a little straighter, understanding that they had received more than just combat training. They had learned humility, respect, and the value of experience over youth. "One more thing," Thompson added, his expression becoming serious again. "When you're deployed, you're going to meet other Marines who think they know everything about fighting. You'll see young soldiers who mock older veterans just like you did with me." He paused, looking each of them in the eye. "When that happens, remember this day. Remember how wrong you were and how much you learned once you started listening. Share that knowledge. Teaching others isn't just about passing on techniques. It's about passing on wisdom. As the 5 Marines prepared to leave for their deployment briefings, each carried with them not just advanced combat skills, but a deeper understanding of what it meant to be a warrior. They had learned that true strength came not from youth or size or natural talent, but from experience, discipline, and the wisdom to never stop learning. Thompson watched them go, knowing that his lessons would travel with them to Afghanistan and beyond. In a few years, these Marines would be the veterans teaching the next generation of fighters. The cycle would continue, ensuring that hard-won knowledge would never be lost. The old veteran picked up his leather folder and headed back into the training facility. Tomorrow there would be 5 new recruits arriving, probably just as cocky and ignorant as the group that had just graduated. He would break down their misconceptions and build them up as warriors, just as he had done thousands of times before. It was what he did. It was who he was. And as long as young Marines needed to learn the difference between fighting and warfare, Staff Sergeant Marcus Iron Mike Thompson would be there to teach them.